Oh, welcome, friends. My goodness, there are quite a few of you out there, but one
Yep.
I'm really excited in particular, to be chatting with today. We'll give folks a couple more minutes to come on in before we get started, but I see people putting in the chat where they're from, where they're dialing in today from. It's great to see people all over the world rocking on with process and architecture. And my goodness, Robert, tell me still before we get started, you've worked all over the world. What are
Yep.
some interesting like regional variations in how people approach business process management?
Well, that's a great question, right? Because
All right.
some some cultures are very specific, and they're very documented and very regimented in how they want to do things, and others take things at a much higher level, and they're just basically show me the facts, right? Show me the facts. Yeah, so they want to map and manage things from a KPI kind of level,
Mhm.
but yeah. So and then everybody's got different rules and laws and regulations that affect them depending on where they live, and all of that comes into play when they're doing their documentation as well. So there's quite a few factors. I mean, there are cultural aspects to it, but there's also regional regulations and laws, and you know that come into play as well. You get into having these conversations with folks and just sort of identifying the various process components, and you can kind of tell what type of communicator they are by the level of detail that they put into their process. They so you have those folks that kind of take you as like it was a yes or no question, but you got all of the color detail that went around. It's like it was really just yes or no. And then the folks that you're like yeah, eventually you got there, but then the folks that kind of like are just literally yes or no. He's like, okay, but I need a little bit more information than that. Can you give me a little more? So all of that comes into play. It's fun stuff. Fun stuff. So
Well, I love
how
it.
about you,
Well,
man? I know
let's
you've
get
worked on a lot
started.
of
Good
different
good
stuff.
introduction, and hopefully from people all over the world, they've got their own regional variations on how they approach process, but we can come to some sort of
Right.
harmonized approach in today's conversation. So, welcome,
Yep.
folks. My name is Jay Emerlins, and welcome to another ARIS webinar in our ARIS and BPM best practice series. I'm the chief evangelist for ARIS. You'll see my face in a few of these, but I'm very lucky to be joined by a series of best practice experts from across the organization and across the industry to help talk about important topics to BPM professionals like me and like you. I've been with the ARIS platform and company for almost 15 years now, but I've been using BPM to drive decision making in my life for a lot longer than that, and work with organizations around the world to help them transform how they approach process and architecture. I believe that there is a way to do this that helps to grow the organization, helps to de-risk your operations, and helps to make people feel more empowered to make meaningful decisions. But I'm joined today, and the speaker for today's conversation is Mr. Robert Thacker, with more than 25 years of experience in the industry across vendors, across different consultant organizations, across clients around the world. He's helped to consistently deliver best practices and meaningful change within BPM projects, within BPM programs, and within organizations. Now, Robert, today's topic is all about good process, the principles for
Yeah.
good
Yeah.
process.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I want to push it to you as our very first question and to kick us off. What does good process mean to you?
All right. So for me, when I think about a good process, and it becomes one of those questions you really sort of have to break down a little bit, right? Because when people think about good process, they could be thinking about it from a variety of different angles. Is it just good process documentation? Like, does my document look okay? Is it defined that way? Is it a good process, right? Is it, does it have all the elements and things that are associated that I should have with regards to a particular process? Is it understandable? Is it, is the process efficient, right? And there's a variety of factors, but really a good process is all of those things. And I typically think of a process is sort of a threefold chord. I mean, if it's going to be a good process, aside from how it's documented or any of the other stuff, right? But first off, a process needs to be or make the most efficient use of the available resources. Its processes, your people, and your technology, right? So a good process will make good, efficient use of those available resources. They also, in turn, need to be defined strategically, right? So, if I've got a process in place, it needs to be aligned in some way, shape, or form to some strategic objective. It's supporting some strategic objective or goal that we have. And then lastly, in order to understand these two, the third point, it needs to be measurable, right?
Hmm.
So if it's not measurable, then I don't know whether or not it's efficient. And I don't know whether or not I'm meeting my strategic goal. Um, if it's efficient but not strategic, I mean, that's great, but it serves no purpose for the organization. If it's strategic but not efficient, then, well, we have other problems, right? Yeah, so yeah, we're not making the best use of our resources that we have. So those three elements for me define what a good process is. It's efficient, strategic, and it's measurable.
I
So
love it.
at its high level.
I hope that folks out there in our audience land have been thinking about what a good process is to them. And I will remind everyone of the chat that exists on the right side and
Right.
of a Q&A section that exists on the right side. So along the conversation and presentation today, we would love to have some moments of interaction. If you have questions, we can answer them textually, or we can bring them up and highlight them here in the main presentation. We'd love to hear from you, the members of our BPM community. And as Robert and I are
Mhm.
talking today, please make sure to chime on in and join the conversation. Robert, I'll pass it over to you because I know we have a packed schedule today as we get
We do.
started talking about good process design.
All right. Well, I'm going to share a little bit of screen here. And as you and I chatted, one of the things that I absolutely do not like about a lot of presentations is when we get into what I will just call death by PowerPoint, right? So I'm going to kind of step away
Yeah.
from that for a little bit. And so we're just going to kind of talk about the sort of the key principles of design today. And as you may have seen, as you looked at the agenda for what we were going to talk about, these are the high level steps, right? So we're going to talk about facilitating discovery workshops. We're going to talk about validating a process for accuracy, how to organize our documentation, how to make sure that we're defining the right level of detail and the relationships that are there. And then the big one at the end of the day is making sure that our processes are then adopted and actually used within the organization. So that's the sort of the area. These are the topics of general conversation that we're going to have. And so to that end, you're not going to see a whole lot of bullet points for each individual slide while we're just sort of chatting about it, just so that we all know what our actual topic is. This is our title, right? So right now we're talking about facilitating the discovery workshops and talking about how work actually gets done, in the context, of these. So we go about defining our having workshops and pulling people in. And I know JM, feel free to chime in because I know that you've held several workshops with customers as well. But
Yeah.
over 25 years, it's just when you go into an organization, one of the big things for having a nice discovery workshop. And a lot of folks, they say, well, we're gonna send out surveys, right? Or we'll do, we'll do some time studies, right? We'll go, clock people and see what they do, and try to capture things of that nature. But we end up missing several steps with regards to that. Or we decide that we're going to have an actual workshop and we're going to put people in a room. And a lot of times when that happens, we leave people out of the conversation. And most of the time, the people that are left out of the conversation are the people that actually perform or are affected by the process that we're talking about right now.
Mm-hmm.
We put a bunch of process owners, in the room. We put a bunch of managers in the room to talk about their individual process. And so at the end of the day, really what we end up with is, this theoretical process where we get an idea of what the process should be, but not necessarily what it really is, right? Because these folks don't perform the steps or work at it at on a day-to-day basis. So we end up with a should be rather than a actually. So really what we want to do is make sure that we've got a nice cross-functional participation in the room. I mean, it's fine to have the process owner in the room, a few managers in the room, but at the end of the day, we also want to make sure that we've got people in the room that perform this process on a daily basis. They're going to provide feedback into it and tell us what's really happening. And a lot of times that doesn't happen. You have any thoughts on that, JM? I'm just gonna.
Yeah, so there's two things about this. I feel like a lot of people like to think that technology can
Right,
replace discovery workshops.
right,
And they talk a lot about process and task mining, which by the way are fantastic tools to
right,
augment this kind of conversation or to spur this kind
yeah,
of conversation. But one thing that I like to say is that data may be king, but context is its crown.
right.
And these facilitated discovery workshops are opportunities to just buy a whole boatload of context. There's two
Mhm.
things that does for me as well. Number one is it helps to connect the data with the reasons why. So as we discover we go through these discovery workshops, we can take data from process and task mining and start to ask hard questions like, well, why do you choose to do this? Do you do this all of the time, user X? Where does this cause problems for you? So I can identify
Mhm.
opportunities for improvement that the data wouldn't necessarily ferret out independently. The second thing it does for me is these facilitated discovery workshops are excellent places to have violent conversations. I'm sure you've
That's a
sat
good
in the
one.
same
Right.
like very
Yeah,
loud rooms as people argue over what the process is. That's good for a couple of reasons. One is I like that people are arguing because they're passionate about that. They're sharing their commitment to this process of process discovery. But the
right.
second thing is it allows them to understand and see each other as executors in the process and come to some sort of agreement on what it
Mhm.
is. And obviously, there, it takes a few iterations and maybe something a little stronger than water, but we get to an agreement about what the process is under the different circumstances it's executed. And there's this whole like exception conversation that I really love because
Mhm.
by forcing us to consider exceptions, we force the company and the process to consider various business scenarios. And that's
Right.
a win because that's an independently valuable thing that I can extract out of it. Business scenarios. I love that. That talks about user journeys, personas, that can talk about different like variations in like input characteristics for how a process might work, the different conditions by which we might have to fix a process if it starts to fail. Like that's really cool. And these facilitated sessions are so powerful for eliciting this information.
Right. Yeah, and I agree. And I think, yeah, it's like people do tend to think they was like people try to, especially nowadays, because technology is what it is, and we love instant gratification where we can get it, right? And so we
Yeah.
have this. We can go into a mentality and think, well, we've got this tool. We've got process mining, we've got task mining. Can't that tell me what my process is? And there we can start to have problems, right? And I usually, I mean, it can to some degree, right? You're obviously missing details, with regards to that. But
Mhm.
I usually preface this as like, if I were running a mining company, an actual literal mining company, and say I was digging for gold or oil, it doesn't really matter what it is that I was digging for. I wouldn't just go set up a drill in my backyard or take a shovel out in my backyard and start digging thinking that I was actually going to find something, right? Process mining tools, task mining tools, they require data, right? They require an understanding of what it is that we're looking for. And mining companies are the same way. Before they start digging, right? There's geological surveys, there's topographical surveys, there's satellite imagery that's done. They have a pretty good idea what it is that they're looking for, what exactly a general idea what it looks like, and how much of it is there before they put the first shovel in the ground, right? And we need to kind of do the same. Really need to do the same thing or understand our processes sort of in a similar way. It can tell us what it thinks our process is, but it's taking it from a system perspective, right? So from a process mining element. So these are all the things the systems are doing, but what about the human elements? Well, those are missing from the process. Well, task mining can help with that a little bit, to some degree while I'm working here on my desktop. But if I have to get up from here and walk over to another workstation and do something and then come back and take the information from there and put it back in, well, it didn't capture that, right? So there are
Mhm.
elements that are certainly missing if we just focus on the technology. So these workshops are extremely beneficial for making sure that we know what we think we do before we validate it with the data, right? That is
Yeah.
there.
I also like
Um,
that the data processing of something like task mining helps
mhm,
to eliminate some bias. You think about
Hmm.
it, if you ask like one person how they do their job, they'll give you one answer. If you
Right.
ask five people how they do their job, they'll give you maybe say three different answers. If you
Right.
ask 1,000 people how they do their job, they give you a difficult to manage number of answers. And so
Right.
using a tool that can sort of harmonize and combine those answers into as few as possible meaningful variations allows you to process lots more data. Because remember,
Hmm.
if you ask that one person, you'll only get that one answer. And
Right.
so just due to practicality, a lot of these discovery workshops have a smaller, like a sampling, but that sampling bias can lead to sometimes to incorrect assumptions. So that's where that process
Right.
and task mining comes in a lot to help to eliminate the bias, but it also doesn't give you the whole picture. So like once again, it's a combination of the facilitated conversation plus the technology driven conversation. And I love
Right.
that.
Yeah, you need, you can't have one or the other. You really do. They help to balance each other and to level set each other and give you a clearer picture of truth of what's really actually happening. Now, the other thing that a lot of folks have a hard time with facilitating discovery workshops is where to start, right? With regards to it. And usually, from my standpoint, it's much easier if we go up like 6 levels, right, and say, explain this process to me the way that you would explain it to, you know, the CEO of the company or your grandmother, right? I mean, it's just kind of, let's just start with, ideally, this is how the process starts. And I'll an example, right? So we want to place, there's an order, right? A new order comes in. At a high level, what needs to happen, right? Well, we receive an order. Yeah, so that starts the process. First thing I do is I validate the customer's information. I enter their order information. I process their payment, and their order goes out. High level, 5 steps. I think we can all agree on that, right? Can we all agree that at a high level, this is what the process should be? Yes. Okay. Now, once we agree at a high level that these are the 5 steps or the 6 steps or the 7 steps, now let's go back and add that detail. Now let's go
Mhm.
back and add, do you always do this? What could stop you from doing? Well, I don't always do that. Sometimes this occurs or that occurs. So there, and this will help us to identify a couple of things. It's going to start to help us to have clearer conversations on where the decision points are actually happening within the process, who's actually making those decisions, if there's a potential risk within the process, some other detail that we might need to know within there. Are there technology dependencies that we have within here? What are the inputs and the outputs of the particular process that we're going through? Other things that it might support for us is, as we start documenting, it doesn't take long before the process, as we start adding the details, that to see the process go from like this to this to this to this, and now it doesn't even fit on our screen anymore, right? So the and
Yeah.
so it can help us to identify, all right, well, where now we can have a conversation around what is the process and what is the sub process within here, and
Mhm.
taking some of the detail that's up here on this main diagram and chunkating that into its own, because it's its own process, right? And so define that, right? So I'm gonna enter, yeah, I'm gonna process the order information. All right, well, how do I do that? Right, there's a whole bunch of steps associated with that. Do I want them all on this one diagram, or can we move that to its own space, right? So that there's a lot of sort of conversation that can help in with regards to that too. But I think when you start small, just to get everybody to agree on, dare we say, the happy path, right, for a particular process, and then go back and add details. Now let's go back and understand where the decisions are. Do you always do this? Do you do that? What would prevent you from doing this? Now we can start to add those other things. So I think that helps with also sort of facilitating. It also shows progress quickly, right? And because
Mhm.
people can get frustrated in these workshops when you start throwing a whole lot of things on the day, they just get attention. There's just sensory overload with all of these things that are happening. But we can show progress very quickly if we just document something small first and then start to go back and add, right? People start to see, oh, we're making progress on this. And that keeps them engaged and keeps them motivated. So
Yeah, I would say there's a really good message here from Florence about, that this some of the other value of this, which is
right,
people realizing that they're not running or knowing the same process as they thought.
right,
The terminology they use, the steps that they describe, like, guess what?
right,
We're not aligned.
right.
And this is a good sort of reveal, maybe earning buy-in by having people realize how far away they are from each other
Yeah,
helps bring them together in a room. And I love that. Thanks, Florence.
yeah.
That's a great comment.
That is a great comment and a great point. Yeah, he said just sort of getting everybody when you have these workshops, getting everybody using the same vocabulary, right? So yeah, I'm gonna call it our CRM. You're gonna call it our order entry system. Another person calls it Salesforce, right?
Oh yeah.
We're all talking about the same thing, right? But this let's level set and get everybody using the same vocabulary. So well, I guess, with that in mind, so what are the sort of the key takeaways for facilitating a good shop? A good session. Well, as we've discussed here, right? The big things are having a nice cross-functional participation, from the people that are performing the process there on the front lines that are in the trenches, turning the wrenches and the screwdrivers and the hammers all the way to the leadership, to the executive chain. Have a nice mix in the room. So, because you're going to have different perspectives on what the process is and what it could be or should be, right? But right now, when we're facilitating a discovery shop, the big thing is documenting or capturing what really happens. We're not in improvement mode yet. We're not in continuous. We're just documenting our as is, our current state. So let's talk about right now what really happens. We're not trying to solve problems. What should happen, push that aside. Let's focus on what's happening right now. And, start small and then go back and capture the exceptions, the workarounds, those extra paths that might be identified within there. And, you're going to have different folks, as we just talked about, use these observations of what people are seeing, when they're out there. Well, I know this is what I'm told, but we don't always do it that way. Or I do it this way, but you just said you do it a different way. So make note of those observations and start to capture the reality of what's really happening, here in our process and, out there and define that within our documentation. So I think moving on now, we have documented it. Now we need to move on. Here's the big thing, right? The validating aspect of it. And so when it comes to the validation portion of it, we talked a little bit about this, before, but there's different things that we can do with regards to validation. And process mining can certainly help to validate some. Task mining can help to. There are tools, right, that sort of help to align these particular components. But also, now that we've got some folks in the room, understand that they aren't the end all beat all. Just because everyone in this room says that yes, that's what it should be, doesn't necessarily mean that it's completely accurate, right? There's always going to be, a subject matter expert that we forgot to invite, right? To this, or that was out that day, they couldn't make the workshop, right? And their value is, their input is still very valuable, right? So don't think that just because they couldn't make your meeting or the workshop that day because they were on vacation or they were sick or they had a conflict or whatever, that, well, we don't need their input. So, snooze, you lose, kind of thing. So go back and validate, even with those folks that couldn't meet with you, and, even engage other folks that were not in the room. Get a fresh set of eyes on it. Yeah. So, now take it back to some of your teams. Let some of those leaders, some of those managers go back and say, so we had a workshop, recently, and, a couple of you folks were involved in that, but now I just want to share it with the rest of the team. We want to get your input on it. This is what we came up with. Does this look accurate? And, does this look right? Get their feedback, right? But then also start to, if we have our process here and we've defined what our process is, again, one of the things I talked about at the onset, with your question, what makes a good process is being measurable, right? Can I measure it? And, so how does this process align with our KPIs, right? How are we measuring this particular process? Can we see as we go through here, what are the customer outcomes? What are our own internal outcomes? What are the compliance needs that are associated with a particular process? Do I have handoffs within here, system information, bottlenecks that need to be identified? what are these goals that we have with regards to our organization, and can I capture them in my process? Now, obviously, if you're using an application for mapping and modeling like Eris, then there is a way for you to identify, right? Right there on the diagram, you can put things in like system information, or you can identify, like risks and things. I personally tend to think of that, while it's great to be able to see it visually, I tend to think of it as a little bit more of clutter on the diagram. I like to think of things a little more simply and wonderfully. Eris does provide attribute capabilities for you to be able to define that metadata as well. And the end result is basically the same, regardless of whether I tied the relationship literally, in the context of the diagram, or I put it in the properties. From a reporting standpoint, my output still shows that there's a relationship between these objects. So when I put things here in the properties, then if I need to know the information, it is there. And as I'm clicking through it, in the context of my process that's been shared with everyone, they can very easily click on an application or click on a particular process step and see the RACI information, or see the system information, or see the procedural docs, or see the risk there. It's still there. It's still visible to them, but now it's not sort of cluttering up my diagram. But again, make sure that it aligns with your business goals, but also don't forget the people that couldn't make it to your meeting, and that there are people that still have valuable input to your process, the team folks that weren't invited. So bounce it off of a few other folks as well, and just kind of get their feedback on it. Don't overdo it, right? I mean, I don't necessarily need everyone in the organization's buy-in and approval for it, but get a few folks to sort of validate what's been going on here within the process.
I want to chime in a little bit here about one other piece of the puzzle here, is to be careful you understand what you're actually trying to do. There's a very big difference between wishful thinking and realistic process capture. Sometimes you're trying to lay down what's actually happening, and that's really important. Remember that somebody who's describing for you and saying the words, "it should do X," you have to validate that X, because it is very possible it is not doing X, and they would like it to, and that's part of your transformation journey, but it's not where you are right now. So am I capturing as is? Am I trying to design it to be on my idealized state? We need to quickly segment that feedback between, is this something that is realistic on what we're doing today, to, is this something that is part of our business goals, so that we can more accurately describe and then decide. Because otherwise, boy, I've been in so many facilitated sessions, which is really confusing, that ends up, as Gil said, people think they can get a big blocker in their head that could cause them to not be able to give the right kind of feedback that gives you a good process. Maybe if you're thinking too hard end to end, maybe you're not thinking about the details. Maybe you're thinking about a business goal that is coming up rather than one you currently have on the table. Like, that's a tough spot to be in, and you don't want to put yourself in a situation where all that work ends up creating more confusion than clarity, because ultimately this is about creating a mechanism to communicate with your community, and that's really important.
Right, and I think there's also the he said sort of validating or quantifying the word "should" also,
Yes.
right? The it should do, and because it. Yeah, because it doesn't, because the process is broken, versus it should do, as in ideally I would like for it to. It would be so much better if it did, right? Because there's a difference, right? In those two statements, in those two contexts. So what does should mean, right? It should mean that well, we're doing this, but we're not, because there's something that's broken in the process, or we should be doing this because I just forgot that we're in as is state, not in to be. And so now I'm trying to throw some to be activities in my current as is documentation. So excellent. Thank you, Carolyn. That's perfect. Yeah. As is process, with the information, and then we can have that to be conversation once we validate that this is where we are. It's kind of it's like if I was giving directions to someone, right? I mean, if I'm gonna tell you how to get to my house, the first thing that I need to know is where you are, right? So I can't give you directions to my house without a starting point. It's the same thing with regards to our process. I can't tell you where we need to be unless I know where I am. And then we can start talking about the adjustments that need to be made. And there was another question that came in, and with regards to documenting and validating, here I'll see if I think it's from Daniela. Yeah, and this is a great question. It kind of steps back a little bit into our previous topic with regards to facilitating workshops. Where do I capture this, right? And this is a great question, because a lot of times, I think JM, we've both been doing this a while, right? So we've seen all kinds of iterations of how people document processes. We've walked into rooms where there's like butcher paper on the table, and we've all got markers, different colored scented markers that most of the time we spend our time smelling them rather than drawing with them, or we've got whiteboards and post-it notes,
With yellow written on the top right of the whiteboard forever and ever.
Yeah. And then what ends up having to happen, right? Now somebody's got to roll this up, right? Take it back to their desk and unroll it, or somebody's like snapping 100 pictures and trying to piece them back together. And then they got to zoom in, right, a little bit. And, now I'm making phone calls because I don't understand your handwriting or what you meant when you said that, right? So, those tools are great, but you have, if you have Eris, right, then why not bring someone into the room that knows how to model in Eris and just have them document for you, right? As you go, they can add the boxes. It's very quick. Eris is great and easy to use from a documentation standpoint, dropping boxes in, dropping activities and decisions and gateways and moving things around. You can just do that on the fly. And now it's already captured before you even left the room, right? You don't need to send somebody out, and a week and a half later, they're sending you the process. You don't even remember what you talked about a week and a half ago. I got to try to refresh my memory. Oh my goodness, on what it is that we were talking about, and what did I mean by that, or what did he mean? Because I know he explained himself then, but I don't remember anymore. So, if we can just document it out, here in Eris to begin with, then we're already ahead of the game, right? We've already, defined it. We've already documented it. It's here within the tool. And guess what? We've also already started to expedite the validation process as a result, because all of these people in the room can now see it, and they can validate that what they're seeing here on the screen in Eris is accurate. And now, of course, using some of the governance capabilities within Eris, we can also send it out to other people for review as well. And again, they can look at it in Eris, and they can navigate around in it, and they can click on things and see the details that were added to it. They're not looking at some piece of paper, either. So it really helps to expedite the validation and the acceptance process as well, if you can just document in the tool right from the beginning. Right. So great question. Thank you for that. So what do we take away?
I'll also say about this, and this is something that ties into the facilitation itself, is that I find it so much easier to document processes when I have a template by which I'm going to ask the right kinds of questions. Now,
right.
In Eris, there's something called table-based modeling. For those of you who've used it, throw your hands up. But for those of you who haven't, the functionality itself isn't really what I'm talking about. Really, the principle is what I'm talking about. Because when you have a table, you have cells that have empty values. Oof. That empty value for me feels kind of like a little bit of a magnet, or like there's a slope on a hill. I feel like I'm drawn towards wanting to fill an empty box by answering a question. And so if I have the right questions posed, it draws people in to provide the right kinds of answers. So a good question I have here is this process implemented using a system? And if so, which one? Oh, wow. Well, somebody thinks to themselves, well, I mean, there's an empty box that says system. Now I need to put whatever system I'm using there. And otherwise, they may not have thought about that. So I love it. I love that sort of like empty space that draws people to give you the right information you want. And it also puts boundaries around the information that they're going to provide. Because yes, as you said, you could collect way too much if you wanted to. But if you have a defined set, it's not like an open world of what you could possibly put there. Instead, they're prompted to put the right information at least first. And I use that a lot.
Right. And that's exactly what Juan, Mendez, thank you, Juan, for posting that. He said maybe table modeling could help facilitate during workshops, right? It really can, because when you do have that empty data, as process people, we all have some level of OCD. So when it comes to the processes, so empty fields and crooked lines all just feel wrong to us, and
Oh
we're
yes.
kind of drawn to trying to fill that information out and make sure that is. But it also helps us to understand the of the things that we don't know the answers to as well, right? So there's other people that we might need to reach out to. Well, who knows the answer to that question of whether or not what system we use or which application we're using for that. So that, that type of those fields and having them blank like that can certainly also help us with regards to that. So thank you, for your comment there. Also Juan. So what do we take away, I guess, from this validation, component here? The big thing is, validate, make sure that we're talking to our process owners, make sure that we're talking to our SMEs, make sure that it is not just the people that were in the room. Go back to the other folks that couldn't make your meeting as well, and make sure that you get their input. Go back to some of the teams, kind of do some spot checking around. Does this look right? Does it feel right as you're looking at? Does this process actually align with the compliance and the regulatory things that we have in play? Does it align with the KPIs that we have within our organization? Have I captured correctly all the inputs and outputs, all the systems that might be within there? Have I identified all of the handoffs, the groups and things that happen to be involved in a particular process? And this can go both ways, right? We can validate handoffs that either currently exist or things that we think exist that really don't exist, right? So I remember working with one organization as we were documenting their process. I kind of felt bad for the guy because his name was like on every process. Well, then, and I'm just going to say Joel. Joel was, involved in this. Now when Joel does, now I get, but by the end of the day, what we found out was, like, for all of these processes, Joel's name was on them, but he didn't actually do anything. He wasn't really involved in any of them, right? So there was a handoff that everybody thought and an involvement that everybody thought that turned out to not really be true. And so he said, I kind of felt bad for,
Joel.
I kind of felt bad for Joel at the end of the day. I was like, oh man, Joel, but the
Joe the
but then
bottleneck. I love him. There
yeah,
we
Joe
are.
the bottleneck. Exactly. Yeah. So exactly. Yeah. He's here, but he's not really even here. Exactly. So a good thing is we were able to eliminate Joe, the bottleneck. Not literally. We just got him in his right place, within the organization, and documented where he really, what his role actually was. Now, once we have started to document our processes, to start thinking about another thing when it comes to documenting processes is how do we organize them? How do we lay them out? What is it what is it that we should be doing? What is, how much detail is too much detail with regards to a process? And there's a few different things that kind of come into, organizing, and I'm a big proponent of less is more when it comes to documenting. And so not having a lot of, we kind of talked about, do I want risks and, systems and everything kind of defined out here on my process. It's great. You can put it on there visually, but you can imagine if you've got a process that's got 20 steps or activities and every one of them uses a different system, and you've dropped all these little system icons on here and all these little document for inputs and outputs that are showing on there. And, oh, this person's also they're accountable. We got to put the RACI information on here. Very quickly, I no longer have a process map, right? It's too cluttered. I can't find anything. So, when it comes to the documentation itself, a couple of things. I do want to make sure that I obviously have defined tasks and decisions that are on.
Yeah.
That's really what the focus is. What are the tasks and what are the decisions, right? And along with that, I should also have a clear understanding of the roles of who's performing them, right? And so this is where, like, BPMN and ARIS really comes in handy, right? When we start thinking about pools and lanes and being able to identify in the context of a lane, what is the role or that is performing this particular task. And now everyone knows exactly who is responsible for performing that. But the big thing when I am doing my documentation at the end of the day is who's using it. Who's using this documentation, right? My audience always needs to be always needs to be considered, with regards to this. So I'm documenting for IT folks. That's going to be completely different than how I'm maybe, modeling for a business user, and how I'm modeling for a manager or an executive is going to be completely different than how I might manage or model, for the end user, for the line user. And this is where having just sort of different layouts, within our organization as well, and having different pages that are identified. So when people come in, they're able to navigate through our processes in a logical way on the level that they need, right? So, I might think of this in a few different ways. If I just sort of share here, if I just go into organizing my layout a bit, this is something out of Eris, right? So something that's logical, easy to flow, to define from, right? So maybe I start, if I'm coming in as an executive, coming in as a manager, maybe the view that I want and how things want to be organized are based more on strategy and KPIs, on things that I'm being held accountable for, things that I'm being measured against, right? And so now I see these things and I've got, all right, well, one of the things that I'm responsible for is, establishing, customer obsession. That's a strategy within there. But, how do I know how well I'm doing with that? Well, we've got, NPS scores and things that are driving that. And all right, well, what are the KPIs that are driving my net promoter score? Where customer satisfaction obviously comes into play with NPS, right? So, here are the KPIs that are driving that particular strategy. But now, if we kind of look out over here, well, we've got processes that are specifically driving what our NPS score is. Well, what is that particular process? Well, ultimately, again, I can get down to that level if I need it, right? And I've got, I've got clear understanding of the roles and the tasks and the decision points that are happening along the way. And if something is being identified, if the NPS score starts to drag a little bit, I can look at which processes define that NPS score and look at which ones are having problems based on my KPI information. Where am I starting to have a bottleneck? Where am I starting to have an issue? All right. So we looked at this kind of from a strategic standpoint, but if I'm a business user, for example, maybe instead of coming in from a strategic standpoint, I come in more, say, from an AQPC process classification framework type view, right? So I come in and the first thing I see is, well, here's sort of a logical grouping of our processes, our management processes, our core processes, our support processes. There are sort of some end-to-end processes within here. But if I were to click on any of these, if I worked in sales and marketing, right? Well, now I know I work in sales and marketing. I'm going to click on sales and marketing, and this is going to show me all the functional processes, right? It might, take me down to another level of diagram underneath of this. It says in sales and marketing, we're responsible for the following things, right? So these are the different functional things that sales and marketing capabilities that sales and marketing brings to the organization. And then if I click on any one of them, ultimately, again, I end up basically down at that same level of a process diagram. So I can continue to drill down that particular way. So we're going to organize our layouts and organize our system in such a way, because creating process documentation and just throwing it into a system doesn't really help anyone, right? You end up with a big mess. Nothing's logically grouped. How do I find it, right? So it needs to be audience focused on the level of detail that's going to be put into it, but it also needs to be accessible to them. And accessible meaning that they can easily navigate to the processes and to the documentation that they need at that particular point in time, right? So in order to make sure that they can perform their particular tasks. And again, same thing with regards to layout and levels. And some of this, when I start defining those particular screens and what they might look like and what those drill downs might look like and what those navigation pages might look like within here, these process chains, as it were, that we're navigating through, is again considering the audience. You remember the example earlier when I was talking to an executive, right? I had, talking about our order process, it was 4 steps, right? Well, 4 steps is enough for them, but if I'm just looking at the order process, it is these 4 steps. But now, what are the capabilities? What are the things that we need to do there? Well, we need to validate the customer information, enter their order, process their payment, and then ship it. Well, how do I receive their information? Let's drill down. Here's another level of detail, right? That's going to tell me that information. When I get done with that, I can come back up. Okay, now I need to process their payment. How do I do that? is that even still my group, or is that the finance department, right? So we drill over to their process. And that's the wonderful thing also with a tool like Eris, is that these things become reusable, right? Just because it's within my documentation doesn't necessarily, it's a sub process for me. And this is the case for a lot of sub processes. A lot of times a sub process for me, excuse me, is just someone else's process, right? So, I might have, this is my level 4, but it's technically your level 3, right? So, or, understanding, that we do have different flows and things that are within here. So when it comes to organizing the flows, what do we need to do? Again, make sure that we've identified roles, responsibilities, follow a good mapping standard, define our standards in place, map from left to right, make sure that we're grouping processes and sub processes logically. Again, having navigation pages to be able to move through and to help people to find their documentation. Don't just dump them into a repository and call it a day. Make sure that they're logically organized. And then, make sure that our documentation is also simple, right? Don't add shapes for the sake of adding shapes to your diagram. Keep it as simple, as possible. And so, which brings us to, again, what is, I guess, we've touched on a little bit here, just sort of defining the right level of detail, with regards to our overall process. Again, make sure that it just sort of resonates. So we've talked about both of these points here with regards to this. So defining the right level gets us into things like, understanding whether or not we're documenting for an executive versus an end user of our particular process, or the business user of our process. Other things, with regards to it, is make sure that it is usable for them, right? So we want to make sure that we include not just our process documentation, but Eris gives us the ability to also define links to everything else that they need in order to perform these activities, right? So it's not just about capturing activities and decisions, but there's also links to their SOP documentation, maybe to a decision tree to help them understand how I make this particular decision. Maybe there's links to a system or application screen that they need. Maybe there's a screenshot within here that they need to understand. If they've got questions, who do they call? Well, that information can be captured within there, as well. If they need research information in order to be able to perform this, right? Again, we can have links to pretty much anything that we need here and tie that right into our process, and have that over in the property details so that we have everything that I need. I can literally just step through the process. I can just click on an activity, and right there, it's going to show me, oh, here's all the links to the reference information, procedural information, system information, that you need in order to perform this task right here and right now. And the other thing that when it comes down to defining the right level is, again, when we start knowing our audience, start to think of our audience in personas, right? So we've got an executive persona that we're modeling for, and they've got this sort of higher level strategic view of things. And then we have our end users, right? And they're a different persona. They're going to use our tool and they're going to use our process documentation differently. And they're going to have different visibility into it. And, it's real nice and easy to be able to have folks, as we go through here, we start talking about process improvement with things. Can they very quickly, when we do have to go back and make a change to our process, can they identify what the change is, right? Can they see what the change was? Does it matter to them? To be able to see that, to be able to compare the difference. This is the way we used to do it. This is the way we do it now. If you overlay these, you can see we actually removed a step, right? So we've simplified the process, or this just became automated. It was manual, but now we're running this in an automated fashion. So there are different things, we want to be able to make sure that in our documentation, we can capture that type of data with it as well. Which I think, JM, brings us to the last point in here, which is ensuring that our processes get adopted, which is huge, right? This is probably, we can document processes all day long, but if nobody uses them, what difference does it make? So when it comes to driving adoption, and I think a lot of the things we've sort of touched on a little bit already just deals with how we're allowing folks the ability to navigate through them, right? Yeah, again, if we just kind of put things in a non-logical way, we've got all of these processes that are documented. We're just going to throw them into Eris or throw them into a repository. We're going to print them off into, then they're not usable and people aren't going to adopt it. And ultimately, at the end of the day, your BPM practice will stall and stumble and ultimately fail because people won't see the value in it. And that's really, Eris is here to make sure that you get that adoption of your processes as well. So we have these embedded links to things, again, making sure that the process gets adopted. A big key to that is to understand that that I give you everything that you need to do the job. Once I'm in the process documentation, there's absolutely not really any need for me to leave and go try to find answers anywhere else. How do I perform this task? I don't know. Let me click on it. Oh, look, there's a link to the procedural documentation. How do I, or what system do I need to be in? What screen do I need to be on? Hold on, let me click the task. Boom. Oh, here's a link that actually launches takes me right to the screen that I need to be on, on our shared service or whatever it is that we're using, for our documentations. But it can take me right into the system, and I can log in or even put me right on the screen if necessary. Now, big thing, of course, again, when considering your audience with the documentation, if you're going to provide links to things, they obviously need to have access to wherever those links are pointing at in order for them to work. Otherwise, and I've seen that, can be a big problem in a lot of organizations. We want to point them over here for some procedural documents, only to find out that they don't have access to that directory on the shared drive, wherever that procedure document is stored. But guess what? Eris allows you to store your process documentation as well. So, now I don't have necessarily a need to even leave Eris at all in order to be able to go, outside of that. Other thing, wonderful thing, now is with AI, right? We have AI associated with our application, which makes it so much easier for folks to get the answers that they want, to their processes. I just received an order. What do I need to do? Oh, let me ask the AI agent. Boom. What do I need to do? Well, you need to do this, this, and this. Oh, and by the way, if you're interested, here's a link to the process documentation where that came from. Boom. How wonderful is that? Oh, something needs to change in this process. Who's the process owner for this? Let me ask the AI. Boom. Here's the process owner. Now I know who I need to call. I could even use it to ask questions if I'm doing process mining or things of that nature along the data. Where is it that I'm seeing the greatest, where the bottlenecks occurring with regards to my process, and have it say, well, according to your data, here's where these are the most efficient and these are the most inefficient. These are where you're having issues with regards to, with this particular process. What are some of the issues that I have? Give me the top three. Boom. Here are the top three issues you might have with your process. You can ask the AI pretty much, whatever, and it's going to sort of help with the driver of the understanding of the information and get me to where it is that I need to go. Make sure, also when it comes to with your processes, that you train your teams on it. A lot of times we turn on systems, we turn on applications, and then we tell everybody, hey, we just rolled out this new application, but then we don't tell them any more about it, right? Or if you're going to roll out a BPM implementation, you're going to use BPMN as your standard. So now we've defined the BPMN is our standard, but we didn't really train anybody on how to model in it or what the shapes or the activities and things mean. That obviously is also going to cause frustration. So make sure that we take the time to actually train our teams and walk them through different processes, that they understand how to use the system, how to read the documentation that they're using. And then, as with anything, when it comes to both of our processes are not static. That is the big thing when it comes to adoption. Understanding that when we do our documentation, that workshop we did at the beginning, that is not a one-time exercise, right? So this is something that is iterative. It happens on a regular basis, that we are reviewing our processes on a regular basis, ensuring that they are up to date, that they are, that they're kept current. And that's another wonderful thing about, like Eris. We start thinking about being able to collaborate or provide feedback into a process, right? Hey, this process isn't right anymore. We're missing an activity here. Being able to allow people the opportunity to provide their input and to supplement our data, with other information. Really, I think we use the term democratize, right? Democratize our process, components. Give everybody sort of the ability to do that. So how do we go about ensuring that our processes are, well, make sure that we have, our workflow tools. We're using this. Eris is a software as a service, right? As a SaaS product. Everybody has access to it. Make sure that everyone is trained on how to use the documentation, how to find the documentation. Make sure that you've identified the roles that need to be there, that there's job aids associated with the particular processes. Make sure that the documentation is easy to be found, right? That I can navigate through it easily. That the folder structure is logical in some way, shape, or form. That the navigation screens that I've created, the process chains that that those all sort of flow and make sense for folks. And then, of course, use new capabilities like AI to help you as well. Everybody likes to play with AI nowadays, so introduce them to the idea of using AI to answer their questions and help them to adopt that as a new source for helping them to understand how their processes work and how they need to do their particular jobs. But understand that whatever it is that we're doing isn't static, right? So we need to monitor the use over time. We need to see who's using it, who's not using it, make sure that our processes are actually living documents, right? They're not just a once and done type exercise. Process improvement and process documentation is an ongoing, BPM isn't a destination, right? It's a journey, right? So you never sort of reach the end, right? It's always sort of moving and always being updated. And the technology is always changing and being adjusted. There's new capabilities being added all the time to assist and support, how we do process management. And so with that, I know we've had lots of questions sort of come in, and we've addressed some of them,
Yeah.
I'm sure, as we went through, our presentation here. But
Oh
I'm
my
just going to
goodness.
pause now. I know we've got a few minutes.
Yeah, I want to share a couple of them because this is the first one. I've been answering questions that are easy to answer in the chat. This one I wanted to get your perspective on because this one is great. How much domain knowledge do you need to design and improve process? Like, what level of expertise is required for the team members who are designing and improving processes? I'll give a little bit of perspective on this because I think
Okay.
there's two components to it. The first is that you need to understand your process. So process executors are good examples of that. We want to lower that barrier to entry for people getting started. Yeah, taking the knowledge out of their head and putting it onto the page. That's important. However, there is also another layer here because besides laying down the knowledge of what you do right now, which is an important part of the puzzle, you also want to design a future state that has some awareness of best practices, maybe for your industry or that process, something that can help to improve the way you do things, introduce new ideas, bring a different perspective. And that often takes sort of a breadth of experience in BPM to at least help you understand what practices are available to you. So not everybody needs to be a super technical deep expert, quite the opposite. I'd rather a very large community of people who know what they're doing and a small community of people who are experts in methodology and improvement. But when I pass back to you, Robert, what do you think about that?
Well, and I agree with you. I think obviously when it comes to capturing our documentation, we want to have the subject matter experts in the room. But as far as actual sort of domain knowledge, right? I think it's good. And, we're both consultants, right? We go into organizations all the time, and, we know we know a little about a lot of things, but not a lot about, so the and as a result of that, right? So I mean, if you are, I've worked, in aerospace, in helping companies in aerospace. I've worked in financial services. Clearly, I'm not, yeah, scientist or a rocket scientist or in any way, shape, or form. However, not having that domain expertise doesn't hinder me. It actually can be a benefit to those that I'm helping because it allows me to see things with different eyes and forces them to explain things differently because I do not have the domain level knowledge. And now, of course, I can ask questions that they would not have thought of, right? So I don't necessarily know that having deep domain knowledge, if you're in a consultant type role, it can be beneficial. I mean, obviously you kind of want to understand where they're coming from and things of that nature and be able to sort of understand maybe what regulations they might be up against. But not having it is also not necessarily a hindrance for you because it's going to force them as an audience to think about their processes differently, as well. Remember at the beginning, I said, we're going to start documenting this at a high level and document it in a simplified way. And if I don't necessarily understand, I was doing some work with a meat packing company, which is always interesting conversations to have with people. But I don't know anything about meat packing, but because I'm there and I'm kind of walking them through the process, I can ask them questions that they wouldn't have thought, that were just intuitive to them, that they would think that naturally everyone knows the answer to this, but that's not the case. And so when they have new people that are coming on that are going to be using this documentation to onboard, now they've documented it in a way that these processes are actually useful for training and for onboarding, not just performing their day-to-day jobs. So
Yeah,
thanks for that question.
I know we're almost done, but I have one more question that I want. I think this is I'll share this question because I think it's good to just lay this out. Should you model your as-is separate from your to-be, or just change your processes? And this is the conversation that I often talk about staging. Sort of how do you create a staging, dev, test, prod style? Like, I would like to develop new processes as a to-be in an area that the larger community cannot see. I would like to validate that with my stakeholders, quality assure that before it gets released to the public, and then eventually release that, replacing my as is with our new way of working. But to me, that requires having separate models. And Robert, when you take a look at this sort of the movement of process through governance, where do
Right.
you see the biggest risks, and where do you see the biggest opportunities?
Well, there's a couple of things with regards to that, and even with what we're talking about here. In some cases, and some of this comes down to because Eris gives you the ability to version, right? So, we might have, this is our version of our application right now, and this is the one that's published, and this is the one that's been shared with everyone, right? So I've documented my as is here, and that's what's shared out with everyone. But then in the same context of that, I can make changes to the model now. I don't necessarily have to publish that new model or make that new model visible, right? So even in that context, now I've got different versions, and it gives me the ability to go back and sort of compare over time my as is and my to be, or my future states. My to be now becomes my as is, right? But each version is now sort of tracked over time, and they're kept kind of the same with regards to that. The big thing, like I said, it just becomes, from a risk standpoint, is publishing too early, right? I wasn't quite ready to share that documentation yet, and now it's out, which can be, make an argument for making sure that they're in separate environments and then just replacing. But then it just becomes that sort of, if timestamps and audit are important for you, then you might want to keep them. You might keep them as the same document and just sort of make sure that you're publishing slightly differently.
Well, with that great answer and a wonderful set of interactive questions. I mean, oh my goodness, you all asked great questions today. Thank you so much for joining us. Alana's going to put up, Alana Bear is, of course, in the background, our wonderful manager for global events here at Eris. She's going to put up a banner here, lets you know a little bit more how to get in touch with us. Feel free to go to eris.com. Find a little bit more about the platform whose principles we espouse with these best practice sessions. And make sure to come back for more of these sessions here with Eris. There's one happening next week. So there's excitement in the air all over the place. Please come to how to transform your user experience using a handy facelift to make your process portal look the way that people want, so they'll come and join you in the conversation. Once again, I've been Jay Emerlinson. That's Robert Thacker. We've had a great time chatting with all of you. Come on back, enjoy it with more webinars for best practices on BPM and architecture, and come experience a little bit of Eris. Have yourselves a wonderful time, and thank you once again for joining us today.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.